So the First World War took place not in the beginning of the 20th century. The First World War took place about 4,000 years ago. And it's when the four kings fought the five kings in the time of Abraham. That was essentially a world war. And we know that during this war, Abraham's nephew was captured. And so Abraham engages in an effort to rescue his nephew, which he does. And Abraham is victorious in his battles. And after his victory in battle, God comes to Abraham and says, "Fear not." God tells him, "Don't be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." And Abraham says to God, Abraham's bothered by this. What kind of a reward am I going to get? Abraham says to God, "What can you give me, seeing that I'm childless, and there's going to be no continuity?" By this time, Abraham's older. So Abraham's saying to God, "What's the point of giving me? What are you giving me, $1 million? So I'll be dead in a few years, and it's not going to be in my family." So God says to Abraham, not only are you going to have a child who will carry on for you, not only will you have a child, but God took him outside. And God said to Abraham, "Look up to the stars. There are actually too many for you to be able to even count." And God says to Abraham, "So will your descendants be." Meaning, not only will you have a son, you're going to have a massive nation. You're going to have a massive nation with lots of people in it. And the Bible tells us, the Torah says, that after this promise, which again, it's pretty amazing because we're dealing here with a very, very old man married to a very old woman. They haven't had any children. So the fact that they're going to be promised all these descendants is pretty amazing. And the Torah says that Abraham trusted Hashem. Abraham trusted in this promise. And God considered this trust as righteousness. God was very pleased and impressed with Abraham's trusting in this promise. And then God goes on to say, and, wait, there's more, and I brought you out of Ur Kasdim, where you came from, to give you this land, the land of Canaan, to inherit it. So now Abraham is told, not only will you have many children, many descendants, but you're going to be inheriting this land. And now Abraham says to God, how do I know that I'm going to inherit it? Now this is obviously a little bit strange because we're told that Abraham believed the incredible promise that he's going to have progeny in his very, very advanced age. So how could 1 minute later Abraham question God's promise that he would inherit the land? It's a very obvious question in the story that all of the commentaries grapple with. Rabbi Elimelech of Grodzisk suggests something more in a homiletical nature, not trying to deal with the actual literal meaning of the passage. But he explains, what is Abraham asking when he asks, how do I know I'm going to inherit it? Meaning the land. So Rabbi Elimelech says it's not really what he's asking. He says Abraham actually totally trusted God's promise of progeny and God's promise of the land. He had no question that this is going to be the case. But what Abraham was wondering about was whether his children and the generations that would come after his children, whether they would also trust in these promises. Because you could read the Hebrew, not only God saying that, Abraham saying, how do I know I'm going to inherit it, meaning how do I know I'm going to get it? The word can also be understood as how do I know I'm going to bequeath it, meaning how do I know I'm going to be able to give it over to them? And his question was, maybe my descendants will not be so worthy. Maybe they won't trust in these promises. And that was his question. Abraham is asking, how do I know, God, that I'll be able to bequeath to my offspring my faith and my trust in you? Because that's what we know Abraham had. Abraham trusted in God, and Abraham had faith in God. And he was wondering, okay, I have it, but how do I know I'll be able to pass it on to my descendants? So we see already at the very beginning of the Jewish story, there's a concern about continuity. There's a concern about whether our children will follow in our footsteps. Now, in our present generation, this has become an increasingly pressing concern. Really, across the entire landscape of the Jewish community. There was a disturbing ad that appeared in Jewish publications a number of years ago. It was a full-page ad, and the headline read, "If you are Jewish, the chances are that your grandchildren won't be." That was the prognostication of this ad that appeared in many Anglo-Jewish newspapers in North America. If you're Jewish, the chances are, statistically speaking, that your grandchildren won't be. It's a very sobering thought. And this exiting from Judaism, this exodus from Judaism, takes many forms. Happens in many different ways. There was a recent Pew Research report. The Pew Foundation does very sophisticated studies of different populations in the world, and they did a massive study of the Jewish community. And they reported in their recent report, a number of years ago, that 30% of millennials, 30% of people born, I believe, after 1988, simply do not identify with Judaism as a religion. They might identify as a Jew ethnically or culturally, but in terms of a religion, 30% of millennials don't identify with Judaism as a religion. We also see significant numbers of Jewish people simply converting to other religions. Not just Christianity, which is the ambient religion in North America, but for example, estimates are that 25 to 30% of North American Buddhists come from a Jewish background. And Jews are overly represented in every religion. In cults, in New Age groups, in various sects, from Hinduism to Baha'is to Jains to Sikhs. There are significant numbers of Jews. In addition, unfortunately, there is a massive degree of assimilation and marrying out of the faith, which have skyrocketed in the past decades. In some areas, over 70% intermarriage. And the truth is that even in the most traditional sectors of the Jewish community, even among the most traditional Jews, the most fervent Jews, the most observant Jews, we're seeing that there is a significant struggle with faith. There was a 6-year study by the Avichai Foundation. They did a study over 6 years of Orthodox students going to university. And they found that after 4 years of university, 25% were no longer Orthodox. That is a massive deterioration. 1/4 of students who come to university fully Torah observant, identifying as Orthodox Jews, have given it up after 4 years of university. So what should families do when facing situations like these? When teens or young adults just say they're no longer interested, or they're not going to participate, or that they're stopping to observe Judaism, or they simply disappear. The first thing I believe that we need to discuss is not what should we do, but what should we not do. I think this is critical. You know, our Torah says in the book of Psalms, Sur me'rav yaseh tov. First, make sure you don't make any mistakes. And then think about what do you do now that's positive. You know, in medicine, the first rule of medicine is cause no harm. And so in my experience, unfortunately, what I've discovered is that many families make all of the mistakes that they shouldn't be doing. And they exacerbate their situation. So let me share with you a number of things I think need to be avoided. And again, given our time constraints tonight, we cannot go through everything, and we're not going to be able to cover every possible case and scenario. I'm going to be giving very general guidelines, and particular situations need to be discussed privately. But just let me share some general thoughts about what should not be done. Number one, families should not beat themselves up. They shouldn't try to spend a lot of time assigning blame. Why did it happen? What did we do that was wrong? The truth is that there are no guarantees in life. Parents could do everything perfectly right. And as people individuate from their families and they establish their own identities, they certainly have the option of choosing not to adopt their parents', their family's faith tradition. Families can hope their children will follow in their ways, but families cannot simply demand it. You can demand that a 6 or 7-year-old do certain things, that they go to school, but once someone becomes a mature person, you can't simply give them commands what they have to believe. You could try to educate, you could try to inspire, you could try to expose, but families have to understand that there are no guarantees. You know, I think it was in 1977 or around that time, there was someone named Jim Fixx who wrote a book about jogging. He became sort of the inspiration for the modern fitness craze. And he was a skinny guy that jogged every day. And he drops dead of a heart attack at 52. He wouldn't be the first person you would expect to pass away so young from a heart attack. We know that David HaMelech, King David, who was one of the most righteous, pious, inspired Jews in history, had a son, Avshalom, who certainly was not a model child. We know that Chizkiyahu HaMelech, Hezekiah, one of our most righteous kings, had Menashe as a child, one of our most wicked kings. So there simply are no guarantees, and it's not healthy to beat yourselves up and to spend so much energy trying to assign blame. Number two, families should not think that they can discern exactly why their child is moving away from Judaism. The truth is that people are extremely complicated. And life is complicated. And we could never fully understand what's going on inside other people. Most of us don't really even understand ourselves. And so we shouldn't think that we know exactly what went wrong, or we understand exactly why our children have an issue with Judaism. It may not be so simple to understand. There may be situations where it is possible to trace something, but it's not always possible. Number three, critical. Families should not criticize or put down their children's new interests, their new friends, the way they dress, It's not going to be helpful or productive to criticize, to put down, to mock. It's a tremendous mistake, as we'll soon see. Families should not argue about Judaism or try to convince their children that they are wrong by arguing and intellectualizing. I don't think it's healthy to send children endless emails or videos to try to straighten them out. It's not healthy to get into a power struggle where it appears to your child that you are on the warpath to make sure that they will re-embrace Judaism. Because what happens in general is the more you push, the more they're going to push back. Now, of course, you don't approve or endorse their current spiritual state of being, but believe me, they know that. They don't need to hear the same speech every day that you're disappointed or you don't approve or what they're doing isn't in line with Judaism. Parents don't really need to keep on making that case. Their kids usually understand very, very well that their parents are disappointed. The most important thing that families can do is to invest in the relationship with their children. To invest in their relationship. And every ounce of energy that is invested in improving their relationship will ultimately pay off dividends. The Baal Shem Tov was once approached by a parent, a father, who was really pulling his hair out of his head because his child abandoned Judaism. This is in the 1800s, late 1700s. This is a long time ago. And the father came to him crying. What do I do? And the Baal Shem Tov said, you have to love him more. You have to love him even more. It's critical that families keep open lines of communication, which means listening and listening and listening. The saying goes that you were created with 2 ears and only 1 mouth. It's critical that children feel that they're being listened to, that their parents are interested in them, that their parents want to hear from them. And that should be encouraged. It may have to be initially safe topics, because there is an 800-pound elephant in the room. But families should seek to increase the intimacy of the discussions, the depth of the discussions. This can be done by asking open-ended questions. Asking the children what's doing with them. If, let's say, they've become Buddhist, to ask them about their Buddhist practice. Now, most parents that I meet would never dream of doing that. They don't want to hear about it. But this is what has to be done. If there is going to be any chance of building a closer relationship, it's not going to be necessarily comfortable. But parents need to communicate, which means a lot of listening, a lot of asking, not loaded questions with an agenda, not questions that are seeking to make a point, which is not a real question, but asking real questions like you're curious with what's doing with your child. If a child, God forbid, converts to Christianity, to ask them what goes on in their church. What do they get out of it? And there are 2 ways of asking that. Many parents ask it in the wrong way, in a mocking way, a dismissive way. Oh, what do you get out of it? As if the assumption is there's nothing there. The parent should ask with a fully curious, open mind, what happens? I'm really interested. I'm interested in you. It's critical that families build rapport with their children, intensify the feelings of closeness and love, and trust. Because what often happens is the trust begins to deteriorate because the children begin to feel that their parents have an agenda. And that every single time they're interacting, the parents are just trying to find some way of getting them back to Judaism. So once the children feel that any interaction is an interaction where they are basically going to be manipulated, then all the trust breaks down and then there's no communication. So there has to be a building of trust and doing the kind of things that might help the child feel that their family loves them and they love their family. It can be done in simple ways, by reminiscing about wonderful things that they did in the past, taking out an album of a trip they took to Israel, whatever it's going to be. But to try to build rapport, love, trust. And then what's critical is to try to join with them. Let me explain what this means. I often tell a famous story. It's a very profound story. I'm not sure it's true, but that's not so important. So in the story, there's a town in Russia, and it was not uncommon for in these towns that there'd be a mayor, and the mayor was also the head of the police department, and he was the judge, and he was the sheriff, and he was the jailer. Basically, the person ran the town. And this particular mayor was not very honest. And for years and years and years, he was skimming off of the taxes that he was collecting and not sending them back to St. Petersburg. So one day he gets a letter, and he's told, our records seem to indicate that you owe us about 30,000 rubles. And he freaks out. He doesn't have 30,000 rubles. What is he going to do? So he did what anyone would have done in that situation back then. He grabbed the first Jew that he found on the street. And he held him for ransom. Crude but effective. He happened to grab a young man who was a very sad situation. It was a young man who was basically orphaned as an infant. And he was raised more or less as a ward of the town. And he had reached an age where they were able to find someone that he was going to marry, and they were going to make a wedding for him. And now he's kidnapped, he's sitting in jail. And the whole town gets together, and they said, what are we going to do? We don't have anything like that, 30,000 rubles. And they're trying to figure out how much they have, and they all submit, how much money they have that they could chip in. They don't have anything. These are very poor people. They live hand to mouth every day. And that whatever they own, whatever they could sell it for would be nothing. So they're really very desperate. What are we going to do? This young man is in jail. His prospects for getting married are now going down the tubes. There happened to be, at this meeting, there were 3 young rabbis that were passing through. They would later become great, great rabbinical leaders. One was Shner Zalman of Liadi, the future Balatanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. One was Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, the Berditchever Rebbe. One was Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. 3 great, great men who were the young men at this point. And they were there, and they also participated in the discussion. And they went off to the side on their own. And Rav Shner Zalman says to the other 2, you know what? I know what we have to do. I know exactly what we have to do. And his friend said, what? And he says, don't you remember that in this town, there is this very, very, very wealthy man who lives in a castle just outside the little town. It's a massive castle. He is a gazillionaire. Obviously, we have to go ask him because he's the only one that has any money. And his friends say to him, are you crazy? He is an apostate Jew. He converted to Christianity. He hates Jews now. And people who've tried to go to him for help, he threatens to kill them. But Rav Shner Zalman said, but you know what? there's no one else that we can approach. That's obviously where we have to go. So he says, I'm going. And his two friends says, well, we're going to go with you. And he says, you can come on one condition. I do all the talking. You guys keep your mouths closed. So they go together, and they get to the door of this big castle. They knock on the door, and this fellow comes to the door. And what does he see? He sees three rabbis. Can't believe it. He says to them, are you crazy? He says, I normally would kill people like you. So Rosh Zalman says, listen, we need to talk to you just for a few minutes. Can we come in for just a few minutes? And for some reason, the person felt, okay. And Rosh Zalman pours out his heart and explains this dire situation as a young man. He was kidnapped. He's an orphan. He's supposed to be getting married very soon. And now his whole life is going to be finished. And he really laid it on thick. And he pulled all the heartstrings of this man. And after 10 minutes of going on and on and on and on, the man said, okay. And he went over to there's a big desk in the room. He goes over to the desk, he opens the top drawer, and he pulls out a kopek, a penny. A old, rusty kopek, and he tosses it to the rabbi. His two friends were flabbergasted. A chutzpah. So this is a penny? But Rosh Zalman goes like this, and he picks up this coin, and he profusely thanks this man. This is so kind of you. We can't thank you enough. It is so generous. It's such a wonderful thing that you've done. And he goes on and on, praising this guy and thanking him effusively. And he says, but you know what? It's a very wonderful thing that you've done, but we need 30,000 rubles. And he goes into the whole story again, and how much this young man is suffering, and his whole life is going to be finished. And he goes on and on and on. Okay. And he goes back again, and now he pulls out a coin for 5 kopecks, and he throws it. This time the two friends had enough. They felt he's mocking us, and they were about to jump on this man. And Rosh Zalman said, I told you a deal. Picks up the 5 kopecks, and he goes into the same story again. How wonderful, how generous, how kind, thank you so much. It's so amazing what you're doing. And after he praises him and thanks him, he says, but, we need 30,000 rubles. Anyway, you can imagine what goes on the next, 15 hours. They're going back and forth. Then he gives him a ruble. He gets a ruble, and then 10 rubles, and then 100, then they get the 30,000. So they go right to the sheriff, to the mayor, and they give him the 30,000 rubles. He can't believe it. And he immediately makes himself a big party, because he says to himself, I have 30,000 rubles now. I'm not going to send this to St. Petersburg. I'm just going to go somewhere else. So he's making a big party, and he frees the young man, and they take him immediately, and that was the day the wedding is supposed to be taking place. So the wedding is underway, and as the wedding is going on, this mayor is getting drunker and drunker and drunker, and he finally takes all of his money, he puts it into his little wagon, and he whips the horses, and he tries to race out of town, but he can hardly see straight, and he crashes into the bridge. He goes flying into the river and drowns, and the impact caused, why it may not be a true story, the impact causes these bags of money to fly all the way, and it lands at the feet of the rich man who decided he's going to go to the wedding. This wealthy man decided, I gave 30,000 rubles to free this young man. I'm going to go to the wedding. And the money ends up at his feet. So he picks up the 30,000 rubles, and he looks at the bride and groom. Here, this is my wedding present to you. It's a wonderful little story, but that's not why I'm telling it. While this is going on, the 3 rabbis are having a post-game huddle. They're discussing like what happened. And Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev and Rav Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk they're blown away. And they ask Rav Shneur Zalman, how in the world did you know what to do in there? How did you know how to handle that guy? So he said the following. He said to them, do you remember when we first asked him to help us out? What he did? How he went over to that table and he opened the drawer and he pulled out a kopek. And you remember that kopek was old and it was rusted and it was dirty. You wonder why? Do you think we were the first person to go to him for help? Probably not. Probably a lot of people went to him for help. He's the only person that has any money around here. And he probably gave the person the kopek. And what probably happened? They threw it back in his face. He said, I realized that we have to be able to accept what he is able to do. Nebuch, unfortunately, that's all this person's able to give. He's a multi-gazillionaire, but he's got a problem. He can't part with his money. All he can give away is a kopek. And how often people are not able to accept what others are able to do. Parents need to learn this lesson. They have expectations for their children. What I expect them to be. What I expect them to do. But you have to be able to meet your child where they are. And that was the genius of Shneur Zalman. He met this person where he was. And the person was only able to give a kopek. He thanked him profusely. It's so amazing. It's so incredible. And he said, once I was able to accept what he was able to do, I was able to encourage him to do a little bit more. So families need to be able to join with their children, to bridge to their interests, to the interests of their children, to do the unexpected, to do the unexpected. Rav Nachman of Breslov tells a famous story that there was a king whose son flipped out and went crazy. And the son began to think that he was a turkey. And the son would basically not have any clothing on ever. And he would live underneath the big dining room table. On his hunches, he would basically be crouching down. And he wouldn't eat at the table. They'd have to throw him scraps under the table, and he would peck at it like a turkey. And they called in every possible psychiatrist and doctor and therapist, everybody in the kingdom to try and help this boy. And no one was able to do a thing for this boy. So finally a wise person came by and said, I think I know how I can help your son. And he basically took off all his clothing and he got down under the table on his back legs, on his legs, out crunching down. And he started pecking at the food. And this prince says, who are you? He says, what do you mean, who am I? I'm a turkey. He says, oh, that's amazing. So now there are two turkeys under the table. And after a while, the young prince is comfortable with his new friend. So this wise man had a signal. And at the proper time, he signaled the people to throw down his trousers. And they threw his trousers under the table. He put on his trousers. And the prince says, what are you doing? And he says, well, who says that a turkey can't wear pants? So he put on his pants. And then, instead of crouching down on his feet and picking at the food with his mouth, he got a fork or a spoon. And he would eat the food with a fork or a spoon. And slowly, he was able to totally rehabilitate this young man. but he had to meet the child where he was. And so parents would be well advised to meet their children where they are. Imagine in a family which is very traditional, their son starts to get obsessed with rock and roll music and grows his hair long and starts playing guitar. Now, the last thing the parents may be interested in doing is listening to their kid play guitar. They'd be very smart to ask if they could listen. Meaning that there is an amazing degree of bonding that takes place when families join with their children to build rapport, to build trust, to build love, to build connection. When this happens, when there is this rapport and connection, there is the potential for influence. There's the potential. And what's important for families to remember is that we influence not by what we say, not by what we say, but by who we are. It's by who we are, not by what we say. By how we model certain things. In Hasidus, they would say, if you want to fill up a saucer with tea, you have to overflow the cup. Don't pour it onto the saucer. Pour it into yourself. Indirect communication is much more powerful than direct communication. If someone knows that you're trying to influence them, they will again generally run the other way or resist. Indirect communication doesn't get that kind of pushback. I remember many years ago when I was a student at Yeshiva University, so we had to take a physical education class. And one of the options was Professor Harvey Sober taught martial arts. And it was very good to sign up for that class because he didn't have to go that much. So that's what I signed up for. But at the end of the year, he had an exhibition he put on. And I went to that. That I remember, and I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. So he began the demonstration by taking some cinder blocks and smashing them into pieces with his fist. Now, when you think about it, a cinder block is not solid. It's basically concrete, poured concrete. It's air, it's whatever it is, schmutz that's put together with. But it's not solid. Like a garden rock would be solid, like a piece of, what are the countertops made of in a kitchen? Granite. That's solid. So the next thing he did was he took a garden rock, a rock like from your garden, and didn't hit it as hard as he could. He tapped it with his fingers gently, and it exploded into a million pieces. And this is many, many, many years ago, I still remember this like it was yesterday. That was such a powerful thing to witness, to see how it wasn't the forceful break that was impressive. It was this gentle break that was more impressive. And it reminded me, when you think about it, when the Jewish people received the Torah at Mount Sinai, so the first time the tablets were given with, it was a cataclysmic event. There was smoke and lightning and the mountain was shaking. It was like a massive, tremendous experience. And what was the impact? It didn't really necessarily work too good, because not too long after that, they built a golden calf. And we're told the second tablets were given bitsina, quietly. And that we still have. So there is a tremendous amount of power in indirect communication. For example, when you tell a story, people put themselves into the story. They don't assume that you're trying to sell them something or convince them. It's a very powerful way of communicating. So indirect communication soft communication, always much more powerful. And it's critical never to give up. It's critical never to give up. We read recently in the Torah about our patriarch Isaac, Yitzchak, who had twin sons, Esav and Jacob. And we know that Isaac wanted to bless Esav. And people are a little bit perplexed by that, because according to our sages, Esav was far from a righteous person. Actually, quite the opposite. And the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, Rav Chaim ben Attar, in his commentary to the Torah, says that Isaac's wanting to bless Esav was not based upon a mistaken impression he had of his son. He knew exactly who Esav was. But why did he want to bless him? Because he believed that the blessings and being blessed by his father had the potential, no guarantee, but the potential to transform Esav. And that it was a possibility that it would lead to him transforming and mending his ways. We know that Abraham was chosen to be the first Jew because Abraham believed that people could change. That's why Abraham argued for God to save all of the people in Sodom and Amorah and Admah and Sivoyim, if there were even 10 righteous people living within the city. I've pointed out previously that he wasn't satisfied just having righteous people in the city. The Hebrew is very precise, betoch ha'ir. They had to be living amongst everyone else, not secluded in some monastery. And Abraham's calculus is that if you have righteous people living amongst everyone else, there is the potential for those righteous people to have an impact by the lives that they model and the example that they set. And Abraham said it's possible that they will be able to influence the rest of the city. Abraham believed that people could change. Noah didn't. And that's why Noah didn't argue with God. When God told Noah the world's going to be destroyed with the flood, Noah says, okay, you're God, you must know what you're doing. You want me to build a boat and save my family? Fine. But Noah apparently didn't really believe that such people could change. And so we believe as Jews that people can change. There's the potential, the possibility. The Torah tells us that when Isaac was about to bless his sons, it's a little bit of a tense story. And we know what happens because Jacob gets dressed up to look like his brother Esav. But when you read that story, it's a pretty hair-raising story in some ways. There's a lot of tension. And what's fascinating is if you read the progression of what happens, the Torah tells us a little detail right before Isaac gives the blessings to Jacob. Immediately before he finally blesses Jacob, the Torah tells us, "Vayarach es begodov." He smelled his clothing. And then he blesses him. And the Midrash, the rabbis teach in the Midrash, don't read this as begodov, he smelled his clothing. Read it as bogdov. He smelled the traitors. He smelled his traitors. He smelled the rebels that would come out of Jacob. And that's what leads Isaac to bless Jacob. He smelt the potential, even among those descendants of Jacob who would totally rebel against Judaism. And the Midrash goes on to give two examples of such rebels. One was someone named Yossi Mishisa. Yossi Mishisa was basically recruited by the conquerors of the temple to go in and remove some of the holy objects. They probably saw Steven Spielberg's movie, and they saw what happens when you mess around with the temple objects. So they were afraid to go in. So they send this Yossi Mishisa and they say, look, whatever you bring out, you can keep for yourself, and we'll take the rest. So he goes in and he brings out something that was very, very precious, and they thought it was too precious. So they said, you know what? We'll keep that one. You go back and get something else. And he started shaking. And he said, crying, he said, I've already angered my Father in heaven once. I'm not going back. And they try to persuade him. And they give him arguments. And they said, we'll let you not have to pay taxes for 3 years. He said, I already angered my Father in heaven once. I'm not going back. Then they start to beat him up. I'm still not going in. And finally, they basically torture him until he dies. And he refuses to go back and take something else from the Holy Temple. And the Talmud tells us that he was someone who entered paradise at that moment. This is Yossi Mishisa, the great traitor against the Torah. And then they mention someone else named Yocham Ish Tzroros, who is a nephew of Yossi ben Yoezer, one of the great sages. And Yossi ben Yoezer was being led out on a little broken down donkey to be crucified. They were going to execute him. And his nephew, Yocham Ish Tzroros, is passing by on a magnificent horse, a beautiful steed. And Yocham Ish Tzroros looks at his uncle and he says with pride, ha! Look at the animal that you're riding on, and look at the animal that I'm riding on. So his uncle looks at him. He gives him a look we can imagine. And his uncle says, you know, if this is what happens to someone, meaning pointing to himself, if this is what happens to someone who does the will of Hashem, who does the will of God, think about what's going to happen to someone who doesn't do the will of Hashem. And we're told that those words entered into his heart like the poison of a snake. And he went home, basically crushed. And they say, I mean, I don't understand this story. They say he built a contraption where he was able to give himself all 4 capital punishments at the same time. It's featured somewhere in Popular Mechanics. It must have been an amazing contraption. But also, the Talmud there says, the Midrash says, that his soul and the soul of his uncle both went up to paradise at the same time. This is the Midrash saying, these are the great rebels against the Torah. And what the point of the Midrash is for us to think about, what is it? What is it that got these two people to change? How come Yossi ben Yoezer wouldn't go back into the temple? And how come Yocham Ish Tzroros was transformed? And the answer is that Yossi ben Yoezer was Yossi Mishisa was transformed by being in a holy place. If you are in a holy place, it's transformative. You know, they say about 100 years ago, there was a young German Jew named Franz Rosenzweig. And he was very assimilated, didn't know anything about Judaism, and he got influenced to convert to Christianity in his young years, or his early 20s. And he decided that on the night before his baptism, he was going to give Judaism one last chance. And he went into a little shtibel, I think it was in Berlin. It happened to be, this was the evening of Yom Kippur, it was Kol Nidre evening. And he says that what he experienced in this little synagogue was so powerful, he walked out resolving never to even think about becoming a Christian again. And he dedicated the rest of his life to being a very, very serious Jew. He became a very serious Jewish philosopher. So he was transformed by being in a holy place. And what transformed Yocham Ish Tzroros? It was meeting up with a holy Jew. It was his encounter with his uncle. And we have the possibility, if you have an experience, if you meet someone who is a holy, spiritual, righteous person, that can be transformative. So we should never, ever, ever give up. One of my teachers actually made a very interesting observation about the Passover Haggadah. If you remember at the Passover Seder, we speak about 4 children. We speak about the wise child, the Chacham, the wicked child, the Rasha, the tam, the simple child, and the eno yodei lishol, the one that's not able to ask. And my teacher, Rabbi Blech, or Benjamin Blech, asked a very obvious question. Why are the children listed in this order? Meaning that maybe what would make more sense is to have on one end of the spectrum the righteous child, the wise child. And on the other end, contrast that with the wicked child. And in the middle, put the other two. And he suggests that maybe the reason we have it in the order that we do is that we're following what looks like to be age. The oldest child is mentioned first, and the youngest child is mentioned last. And now the sequence makes a lot of sense. When we start from the youngest child, this child is so young they don't even know how to ask. They just look. The next child up is a little bit older and very simple, and might be able just to say a simple question like, what's going on? The older child after that is the rebellious young teenager, at a stage in life when children are becoming independent and individuating from their families. They have a difficult time accepting their parents and their parents' values and their parents' guidance. But Rabbi Blech says the sequence doesn't end there. As a child gets older and becomes a mature adult, they become the wise child. And he suggests that maybe these are not four different children. Maybe the Haggadah is speaking about one person that goes through different stages in life. My Blech quotes Mark Twain, who famously said, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in those 7 years." So I want to conclude with one final thought. It's very understandable that families can feel powerless when a child rejects Judaism. But as we've tried to show tonight, there are things that we can do. One vital thing that I haven't discussed yet is the critical importance of praying for our kids. There's a famous story where the Ksav Sofer, one of the great rabbis of Europe, he was the rabbi of Pressburg, and in his town there was a Jew that was sentenced to hang for a crime that he didn't commit. Innocent, but he was sentenced to hang. And the Ksav Sofer did everything that he could. Everything that he could in his powers to save this condemned man, but to no avail. He killed himself trying to meet with this person and try to influence this person. Nothing worked. And the night before the hanging, the Ksav Sofer was broken and he cried himself to sleep. As he slept, his father, the Chassam Sofer, appeared to him in a dream. And he had a very angry face. And his father said to him, "How can you sleep when an innocent man with a wife and children is going to be put to death?" So the Ksav Sofer says to his father in the dream, what should I do? I've already tried everything. And the Chassam Sofer said to his son, "But why aren't you praying? You have to pray and pray and pray some more." And amazingly, we're told, this is a true story, that Ksav Sofer immediately got out of bed and he gathered the entire community to the synagogue for prayer. They prayed throughout the night, and in the morning, miraculously, the judge agreed to investigate the case further, and the man's life was saved. In the book of Exodus, in Shemot, chapter 6, verse 12, we know that God appeared to Moshe and gave him the task of leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. You're going to go and say to Pharaoh, let my people go. And we know that Moses initially refused. And he puts up a tremendous fight with God. Gives God every reason in the book why I'm not the person, choose someone else. And one of the reasons that Moses gave was that he suffered from a speech impediment. And God still said he should still go to Pharaoh because Aaron is going to be his spokesperson. So Nachmanides the Ramban asks a very simple question. Why send Aaron as his spokesperson? What could God have done? God could have simply healed Moses' speech impediment rather than have Aaron sent as a spokesperson. So why didn't God do that? Why didn't God heal him? And the answer is because Moses did not ask. Moses did not pray to be cured. Hashem was prepared to provide the cure, but it was withheld because a request was never made. Asking is necessary. Praying for a child to be moved to return to Judaism is critical. Praying for our children to meet the right people, to have inspiring experiences. We can't pray for someone to change their mind, but we can certainly pray for them to meet the right people that may have an impact on them. And so I encourage all families to pray ceaselessly, not out of a prayer book. It's true that when we're praying the daily Shemona Esrei, the daily list of 19 blessings, one of the blessings is a blessing for repentance. And our sages say that when we're praying for God to help us repent, we should have in mind that other people that need to repent should do so as well. That's not an inappropriate thing to do. But we should pray in our own words. We should just privately speak to God in our own words and cry to God and beg God to help our children return to Him. God willing, those prayers should all be answered.